Pizza Power!
In 1981, there were two young, aspiring comic book artists. They met up to talk stories and had no idea they were destined to leave a permanent mark on the comic and entertainment industry. Those two young men were Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird. To pursue their dreams in the comic book industry, Kevin moved in with Peter, and they worked regular jobs to pay their bills while drawing comics in their free time, with the goal to perfect their craft and become successful comic book artists. Whatever it took, they wanted to succeed. During one of their many drawing sessions, Kevin sketched a turtle with nunchucks just for fun, and Peter called it a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. They took the idea and ran with it. Up until that time, Peter had been selling illustrations at $10 a pop. Kevin's financial situation wasn't any better. In 1984, he took a loan from his uncle, and along with their combined tax returns, they paid for their very first black and white comic that they self-published. They ended up calling their publisher Mirage Studios because, as Kevin said, there wasn't an actual studio, only kitchen tables and couches with lab boards. From that moment, the concept of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was born. The pair drew 4 turtles, each with their own ninja weapon, and Peter outlined the whole idea in ink. The original drawing they made sold at an auction for over $71,000, but this was the original beginning of the Ninja Turtles comics, which became so popular that it became the focus of multiple video games, a TV series, and movies over the years. The rest, as they say, is history. In today's video, we'll explore the very beginnings and inner workings of TMNT and the challenges it conquered along the way. This is the rise of the Ninja Turtles. When Kevin and Peter created the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles back in 1981, they had no idea the success the concept would bring them. They named the Turtles after famous artists from the past and filled their comics paying tribute to other comic book heroes that they loved. To fund their first comic, they had $500 from Kevin, $200 from Peter, and borrowed $1,300 from Kevin's uncle. They managed to advertise the comic in a magazine, which led them to selling all of their copies, all 3,000 of them, within 3 weeks. Kevin paid back his uncle for the loan in the same month. A second printing was made of 15,000 copies, and then a third shortly afterward of 35,000 copies. Within 2 years, they teamed up with a licensing agent who sold the turtle concept to dozens of manufacturers. In no time at all, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles became popular, beyond Kevin and Peter's wildest dreams. First prints of TMNT #1 are considered rare, at least by 1980s standards, with a little under 600 unrestored examples graded in the Certified Guarantee Company's census. A first print comic with a 9.8 of 10 rating recently sold for $245,000 in 2021. The creative duo became well known across the world. According to their first publishing agent, Mark Friedman, kids seemed to have a network of communication, and kids made us hot. It was actually the kids consuming their comics and toys who loved the characters so much that they talked. And those friends told their friends, and those friends told theirs, and so on. While Kevin and Peter were the comic dream team, it wasn't always smooth sailing. At first, they faced a lot of backlash with claims that their comics were not really for kids. The Ninja Turtles, as you remember them, used to be quite different. To make the Turtles more suitable for younger readers and increase the appeal of their comic to a wider audience, the Ninja Turtles had to change. That's when the writing was injected with a more comical and light nature, and of course, a love for pizza. The bad guy, Shredder, was also originally written as more of a dark and sinister adversary, and he was actually changed to be less scary and more like a funny, quirky villain instead. The Foot Clan were changed to robots to make fights less violent. Even the way the Turtles talked was adapted to fit their new target audience.
Cowabunga! Cowabunga!
And instead of just having different weapons, their unique colors and belt buckles were added in to distinguish them. Kevin and Peter, as the creators, did have the final say on these changes, and they accepted that changes had to be made, but they didn't really like having to do it. As Kevin said in a 1998 interview for the Comics Journal, the resolution at the end of the day, even when Pete and I both agreed, there was some stuff we really didn't like, and some stuff that we wish we hadn't said yes to. The creators had changes they wanted, but at the end of the day, they agreed to many of the changes. Because, as they said, we'll always have our black and white comics to tell the kind of stories we want to tell. The pair had grown up in awe of Jack Kirby and similar artists, and felt a connection to the more adult themes in some of the Marvel and DC offerings of the time. But it became clear that their creation landed well with children, not adults, and the writing needed to fit the age group the characters appealed to. In 1987, a company called Playmates introduced the first line of Turtles toys. They tried to promote the toys with a short TV series, and at first it didn't have much success, although over time it would grow and grow in popularity. The TV show eventually ran from 1988 to 1996 and became a cult hit, inspiring even more exciting forms of entertainment for consumption: video games. The Turtles became absolutely historical, and by the late 1980s, the IP was worth $350 million per year. They were the top-rated kids' TV show, and toy sales went through the roof. Then in 1989, the perfect storm had brewed and the Turtles were introduced to a growing video games industry. That year, the game studio Konami was responsible over the years for arcade games like Scramble and Frogger, along with a series of beloved home console games such as Contra, Castlevania, and the Metal Gear series. They hit the jackpot by obtaining the license for one of the hottest franchises in the world at the time, and they set out to work on a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game. This marked the birth of the first TMNT video games, two of which were released in 1989, one for arcades and one for the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES. Both games turned out to be massive successes. However, despite sharing the same name, the arcade and NES versions of TMNT were remarkably different from one another. The arcade game drew inspiration from the immensely popular animated series and became one of the biggest hits of the era. It was a pioneer in 4-player cooperative play, allowing players to take on the roles of the 4 heroic turtles: Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael. The game also featured the Turtles' iconic adversaries: Bebop, Rocksteady, Baxter Stockman, General Trag, Krang, and the infamous Shredder for players to face off against. The arcade version of TMNT was a colossal success, and so much so that Konami struggled to keep up with the demand for arcade cabinets, and they had to outsource their production. Tens of thousands of TMNT cabinets were sold worldwide, making it Konami's highest-grossing arcade game ever. On the other hand, Konami's NES adaptation was also successful, but it offered gamers a different experience to its arcade counterpart. The NES version was a single-player action performer, unlike the frantic 4-player beat-em-up style of the arcade version. In this game, if one of the turtles was captured, players had to continue as one of the remaining turtles, and if all 4 got captured, it was game over. It was a notoriously difficult game, but the NES version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles sold a whopping 4 million copies. But there was a major problem with one version of the game. Ports of the game for PC in North America contained a programming error, which created an impossible gap that players just couldn't jump across, no matter how hard they tried. Eventually, the error was fixed, but perhaps it was a tale of epic foreshadowing. Keen-eyed gamers might be wondering, wasn't the Turtles game for Nintendo NES made by Ultra Games, or Palcom for those of us outside of the US? Ultra Games and Palcom were regional branches of Konami. They were set up so that Konami could get around Nintendo's rule that third-party companies could only release 5 games a year for their system. Those companies were set up just so Konami could release more games that year. The developers used a cutting-edge trick called flickering to handle lots of characters on screen at once. The problem was that NES could only show a certain number of characters at a time, but by quickly switching which characters were on the screen, they could show more without crashing the game. In response to feedback from fans who found the 1989 NES game too difficult and divergent from the TV show, Konami developed Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time for the arcade in 1990. This time, their aim was to provide a more faithful representation of the characters and a more accessible gameplay experience. During the early 1990s, the beat-em-up genre was on the rise, with numerous franchises offering similar gameplay, with Streets of Rage being the most memorable game of the time. To set their TMNT games apart, Konami began to introduce new mechanics. One such mechanic was the ability to throw enemies towards the screen, a fresh twist from the saturated beat-em-up formula that was everywhere. Turtles in Time was actually a lot like the original arcade game, but with some big improvements. It had new moves, new powers, and cooler levels because it was about time travel. The turtles were thrown into different times in the past, like the time of the pirates, and even in the future, 2020. It was a bit strange for some fans that in the plot, Shredder tried to stop the turtles by sending them back in time, but also sending his army back in time to fight them. Despite questions about the story, many people have Turtles in Time as their best Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game ever. It's infamous in the world of beat-em-up games, just like the first one, and it came to a Nintendo console the next year as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4: Turtles in Time, the first TMNT game for Super Nintendo. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Fall of the Clan came out for the Game Boy in 1990, and in 91, Konami published Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Manhattan Missions, but this one was only for computer players. Unlike the NES game, it was actually possible to finish this one bug-free. Manhattan Missions was different from the other TMNT games released. Instead of being a typical platformer, it played more like the original Prince of Persia. The turtles could walk around and fight with their weapons. This type of adventure game would eventually take over and become the open world genre that dominates the gaming industry today. Despite being quite cartoonish, Manhattan Missions was more inspired by the darker TMNT comics and the slightly scarier but quirky 1990 live-action movie. The live-action movie was the highest-grossing independent film ever made at that time. Manhattan Missions is known as a hidden gem amongst the Turtles games, and is a bit more of a cult classic from the early run of the games in the 90s. In 1991, new games for different game systems were released. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, Back from the Sewers for the Game Boy, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project for NES. The Manhattan Project may have had a similar name to the Manhattan Missions, but it was based on the TV show and played like Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, and it too was a hit. In 1992, the Turtles appeared in a new video game on the Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive as it was called outside of North America. This game was called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Hyperstone Heist. Even though it had some similarities to Turtles in Time, it was a separate game in its own right, just following a similar theme. Different consoles, of course, had different abilities. When Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Hyperstone Heist was made for Genesis, it was a new engine, due to the Genesis having new and improved capabilities over earlier consoles. The developers had to make the title with smooth-moving screens, bright colors, and easy-to-use controls, all made specifically for the Genesis and its army of new gamers. By the early 1990s, one-on-one fighting games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat were becoming the most popular games on the market. The classic Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles games were more about working together to beat up bad guys than they were about fighting against your friends. The studios producing Turtles titles knew they needed to switch things up to stay in trend, so in 1993, Konami made Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters for multiple platforms. In this game, you could have one-on-one fights between various characters in the comics, shows, and movies. Though it was basic for a one-on-one fighting game, it became popular for beginner gamers and fans. It also allowed for plenty of tactical gameplay for those who were already experienced in the genre. The SNES version of Tournament Fighters is known amongst gamers as the best version of the game, but it was released across many other consoles too. Konami even made a version of Tournament Fighters for the old NES in 1994, which was the last game Konami ever made for that system. As of 1993, the first 11 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games had sold 18 million units worldwide, earning nearly $450 million in sales revenue. This was a time when video games were bestsellers and dominating the markets. But in the 90s, this fell off. And it wasn't just the games that struggled to be successful as the 90s went on. The original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle animated series ended in 1996, and after that, the games failed to capture their original magic. The straw that broke the turtle's shell came in 1996, during the pre-production of the live-action reboot series Ninja Turtles: The Next Mutation. Eastman and Laird, the owners of the Turtles, had to sign off on a new concept invented by the producers. That concept? Venus de Milo, the first female Ninja Turtle. While Eastman saw potential, Laird was against it. It was the biggest disagreement we'd ever had, Eastman recounted. Eventually, Laird gave in, but it was all for nothing. The show flopped. Critics and audiences hated it, and it was canceled after just one season. Shortly after that dismal failure, Eastman surrendered his rights to the franchise over to Laird, which marked the official divorce from his friend and professional partner. Laird said that he wished things had been different. He wished they had remained as tight as they had been in the early days. Laird continued to shepherd the franchise through new cartoons and toys until Viacom came along. In 2009, he sold the Turtles to the media conglomerate for $60 million, and the Turtles continue to thrive under the Nickelodeon brand. Though Eastman got nothing, he continues to act as a consultant on the new movies, shows, and even wrote several volumes of the reboot comic under IDW Publishing. Then, in 2003, a new Turtles TV show started, which led to a new slate of games being released to go along with it. The first new game was simply called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and it hit the shelves in 2003. It looked like a cartoon with new and advanced graphics capabilities of the time, but people found it boring to play and was limited to 2 players. Another game was released for the Game Boy Advance in the same year, which performed better, but not to the levels the developers wanted or expected for such a nostalgic franchise. In 2004, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 Battle Nexus was released, and now 4 friends could finally play together in multiplayer on modern consoles. But still, the original magic was not rekindled. The 2 games that were released in 2005 still achieved nothing when compared to the success from the past. Despite that, more attempts were made by various studios to make the Turtles game that mixed the modern technology and the power of gaming consoles and computers. At the same time, they wanted to capture the true essence of the franchise, but ultimately they couldn't compete. You had other games in the genre like the Batman Arkham series games. For nearly 20 years, it seemed as though the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles would never see the light of day in the modern console era, and characters from the franchise were repeatedly subdued to mere cameo appearances in other games like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and esports games like Smite. But in 2022, a game was finally released that restored hope for the Turtles. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge was released, a fun classic-style beat-em-up game for 6 players in multiplayer game modes, a modern twist on that original smash hit. It didn't break any sales figures, but it went down well amongst fans overall, giving hope that future games about our favorite green-shelled teenagers might just find that same spark that the very first arcade game did all those years ago. So, which Ninja Turtle is your all-time favorite? Did you play any of these games? Are there any other iconic franchises you'd like us to explore next? Share your thoughts in the comments, and as usual, like, subscribe, get notified, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.
Wise man say forgiveness is divine, but never pay full price for late pizza.
I gotta get a new route, and I thought I delivered everywhere.